Welcome to the deep dive. If you're preparing for a meeting, trying to get up to speed on a complex field, or you're driven by that need to understand the big picture quickly, you are in exactly the right place.
Today, we're wrestling with a subject that it really touches every family. It consumes so much public debate, education.
And specifically, we're dissecting the really intense ethical and systemic tensions that surround private schooling.
It's such a charged topic, and our mission today is to, try to move past the simple political slogans. We're taking a deep dive into the diverse sources you've provided us. Everything from psychological studies of teachers in Turkey, philosophical arguments about justice, all the way to legal analyses of the U.S. Constitution.
Yeah, and we've got two huge interconnected areas to explore. First, we're going to shine a light on the intense ethical pressure cooker that exists inside private schools.
Right.
We're talking about the almost impossible daily dilemmas that teachers face when they're caught between their professional conscience and the demands of, well, their employers or their clients, the parents.
And then second, we zoom out to the macro level. The massive societal debate over whether choosing private education is even morally justifiable when public systems are struggling.
That's it. We'll be exploring that core conflict between a parent's deeply ingrained duty to their own child and, their perceived responsibility to society, to the common good.
A personal duty versus a societal one.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this. Our sources really emphasize that schools are these dynamic, multi-component systems. It's not simple.
No, not at all. When you have teachers, administrators, students, and paying parents all interacting, well, conflicts are just inevitable. Teachers are constantly struggling to decide whether to stick to their own professional principles or to give in to the often conflicting principles of those other stakeholders.
And this struggle has real, measurable consequences.
Oh, absolutely. The research is very clear. This inner ethical conflict dramatically increases teacher stress and anxiety, which of course negatively affects their performance in the classroom. But what really stands out from the studies we looked at, especially the ones focused on private school educators, is that these dilemmas are different from what you see in public schools in one critical way.
And what's that critical difference?
It's leverage. The difference is leverage. Private school teachers are dealing with all of this under the constant, immediate threat of losing their jobs. The absence of traditional job security, lack of tenure or a strong union that often shields public school teachers, it heavily influences how these conflicts are resolved.
So it's not a level playing field, ethically speaking.
Not at all. The sources are definitive on this. When a teacher faces a choice between their conscience and compliance, the resolution almost always aligns with what the administration demands. Job security becomes the ultimate ethical lever.
That structural reality is a huge insight. It really defines the entire private school environment. So let's start right there. Inside the school walls, and explore the main arenas where these ethical dilemmas pop up.
Okay, let's begin with the most visible source of conflict, the pressure from parents. The research often frames this around something called the grade grubbing dilemma.
Grade grubbing, yeah. It's about this commodification of academic success, where parents feel that since they're paying a premium, they're owed a certain result.
It's a transaction.
It's absolutely a transaction in their eyes. The demand for higher grades is a recurring and, frankly, often unethical source of pressure. Parents who are placing this immense importance on course grades will actively pressure teachers to inflate their kids' marks, and that immediately puts the teacher's professional integrity on the line.
We have this really visceral anecdote from the research. It's from a participant they labeled P3, a maths teacher, and it just crystallizes the pressure perfectly.
Oh, this story. It's incredible. So T3 has this conversation with a parent. It's a grueling 40-minute exchange where the teacher is trying so diligently to explain the academic rationale, the school policy, all the reasons why they just can't raise the student's grade. It's a firm, professional defense of standards.
But that defense was completely meaningless in the end. T3 recounts that shortly after that long, rational conversation, they were summoned to the administration's office.
And what happened there?
They weren't asked for their opinion. They weren't asked for evidence. They were simply ordered to raise the child grade, regardless of the teacher's judgment, the student's actual performance, or the school's own rules.
Wow. Ordered. I find that shocking because it just completely devalues the teacher's expertise. 40 minutes spent defending academic standards, only to have the administration basically confirm to the parent that, yeah, those standards are negotiable.
Exactly. And what was T3's internal reaction to that command?
What did they report?
The teacher reported feeling genuine guilt. The conflict wasn't just external anymore, it was now internal. They were forced to violate their own professional integrity just to keep their job.
And that single action shows how the lack of job security can just warp a school's whole mission.
It does. Rigor becomes secondary to retaining a paying customer. And the long-term implication is systemic, If teachers can just be ordered to change grades, what credibility does that school's academic promise even have?
And these conflicts with parents go beyond just the transcript, right?
Yeah.
Teachers face these really serious ethical dilemmas about even interfering with parental judgment.
Yeah, they hesitate to warn parents about how they should treat their kids or maybe suggest more effective parenting strategies even when they see destructive behaviors happening at home.
Why is that boundary so fraught in the private setting?
Because the whole relationship is often viewed through a client lens. In a public school, a teacher is an agent of the state focused on the child's welfare. In a private school, the parent is the client.
And you don't criticize the client.
You don't. Crossing that boundary, suggesting the parent is failing in some way, is a direct, high-risk confrontation. The teacher is terrified of alienating the source of the tuition fee, which translates directly into professional consequences for them.
This feeds right into that ethical tightrope walk about informing parents about genuine issues, whether it's academic decline or behavioral problems. Teachers actually face a risk by informing parents?
They absolutely do. A teacher has to decide. Should I inform the parents about their child's misbehavior or their academic struggles? And the sources note this terrible irony.
What's that?
Talking to some parents, especially influential ones, about misbehaviors not only fails to produce results, but it can actually create significant problems for the teacher.
Like complaints to the board.
Complaints to the board, a negative performance review, even job termination. So what happens? Teachers might choose silence. They might sacrifice the student's welfare for their own job preservation. This is where that pressure cooker really builds internal steam.
So let's move from parental pressure to the conflicts that involve the school administration itself, which is often powered by that same structural threat to job security we just discussed.
Right. Ethical dilemmas are constantly arising when a teacher's personal values, their deeply held beliefs about education and fairness, contradict the values or the decisions being promoted by the school administration.
And this is especially sharp in private schools.
It's particularly sharp because the school might have a very specific ethos. Maybe it's faith-based, maybe it's hyper-competitive, that just clashes with the teacher's personal worldview.
And we know the pressure from the administration can be absolutely crushing. Why is that?
It's because of the high expectations placed on private schools as businesses. They are selling a premium product and they have to deliver.
Right, they have to justify the price tag.
Exactly. And that translates into increased demands on the faculty, higher workloads, expectations for after-school involvement, constant pressure to ensure there are measurable success metrics. This leads directly to significant work stress for the educators, who feel like they have to constantly over-deliver.
And as we've established, the resolution of these ethical conflicts is overwhelmingly tilted towards just complying.
That's probably the most critical finding in this whole section. The study found that private school teachers mostly resolve their ethical dilemmas in line with the demands of the school administration.
And it all comes back to job security.
It's fundamentally linked. The absence of tenure, the lack of strong union protections, these structural safeguards, it negatively affects teacher self-confidence, and it gives the administration almost total leverage. If you need that job to pay your mortgage, you will comply with the order to change a grade. You will ignore a parental inadequacy. You will prioritize marketing metrics over deep learning.
It turns education into a product that has to please the customer.
That's it. And that makes the ethical conflicts qualitatively different from the public sphere, where a teacher might at least have a grievance procedure or union support to fall back on.
Okay, now let's look at the third cluster of these dilemmas, the ones involving students and coworkers.
On the student side, the conflicts are really complex and nuanced. Teachers are facing questions like, should they engage in what the research calls positively discriminating against students with special situations?
Meaning what, exactly?
It's a genuine ethical conflict. Is it fair to the rest of the class to modify a test or a grading scale for one student? Or is it fundamentally unfair to deny that student the support they need to thrive?
It's that classic tension between equality and equity, right?
Precisely. And you also mentioned the ethical challenge of adjusting the difficulty of course materials. Do you lower the standards to make sure everyone passes, which maintains the school's nice-looking statistics and avoids conflicts with parents, even if it compromises academic rigor?
Or do you maintain that intellectual rigor, knowing that some students will genuinely struggle and maybe fail and definitely complain?
Exactly. And that ties right back to the grade-grubbing dilemma. But here, the teacher is often self-censoring before the parent even gets involved.
And then there's the deeply personal issue of confidentiality handling secrets kept by students.
This is a massive weight on a teacher's conscience. They have to balance the student's trust, which is vital for a healthy mentor relationship, against their moral and sometimes legal obligation to report potentially harmful information to parents or the administration.
And if you break that trust, the relationship is over.
It's over. But if you keep silent, you could be compromising that student's safety or the safety of others. It's an impossible position.
Now let's shift to the coworker dynamics, where professional trust and the educational mission are constantly being tested.
Indeed. Teachers face the dilemma of whether they should warn or report a colleague whose approach to students they just don't approve of. Maybe that colleague is ineffective, maybe even emotionally abusive, or just undermining the curriculum.
And this gets even more complicated when parents get involved.
Oh, definitely. Should you discuss complaints that you've received from parents about a coworker directly with that colleague?
That sounds like a minefield. If you discuss the complaint, it could be confrontational, destroy the workplace environment. But if you stay silent, you're potentially allowing poor practice to continue, which could harm students.
Precisely. Reporting could mean disrupting the whole educational process or creating a hostile, competitive work environment. But silence compromises student welfare. On top of that, the sources cite competition among teachers as another significant source of these dilemmas. Private schools often operate in a competitive market, and sometimes that competition turns internal. You have teachers competing for resources, for prestige, even for student enrollments for their specific programs. And this just further complicates any hope for transparency and trust among the faculty.
So the analysis here is really crucial. These are high-stakes settings where teachers feel like they're caught in a business model.
Yes. As the research notes, they may feel they're not getting what they deserve for their work. But at the same time, they're deeply uncomfortable with disrupting the educational process or compromising their own integrity. It's a system that seems engineered to prioritize organizational stability over an individual's conscience.
That internal ethical tightrope of the private school teacher sets the stage perfectly for the massive systemic debate about equity. We're moving from the individual's dilemma to the societal implications of opting into the system. Let's start with Section A, the systemic inequality of private schooling.
Right. Before we get into the philosophical critique, we really have to acknowledge the undeniable allure of the private system. Private schools offer tangible, significant advantages that attract parents.
We're talking about things like smaller class sizes, right?
Smaller class sizes, greater curriculum flexibility. They aren't tied down by state-mandated curriculum if they don't want to be. And of course, extensive resources.
What kind of resources specifically?
We see superior technology, access Chromebooks for every student, smart boards, specialized assistive tech plus advanced facilities, better science labs, and a much wider array of robust extracurriculars. High-level sports and arts programs that are just beyond the reach of many underfunded public districts.
And the source material is adamant that this attractiveness creates a destructive negative feedback loop that fundamentally stratifies the entire educational landscape.
It's a classic case of reinforcing inequality. Better private schools, often because they can offer higher pay or a better work environment, attract and retain better teachers.
Which creates a brain drain from the public system.
A persistent and corrosive drain of intellectual talent and human capital. When the best, most innovative teachers leave the public sector, it harms the quality of mentoring for younger public teachers, and it slows down curriculum innovation for the entire system.
And the funding disparity just makes this worse. The sources mentioned examples, I think, in Australia, where government funding disproportionately favored private schools.
That's right. It grew at something like 61% per student, compared to just under 39% for public schools over a decade.
That kind of funding favoritism effectively locks quality education behind a financial paywall.
It does. The experience in places like Nigeria, where the quality of education is directly shaped by the price of school fees and not the student's potential, illustrates this perfectly. It establishes education as a tiered commodity rather than a universal right.
And the consequences of this stratification are profound. They extend far beyond just the K-12 environment.
Absolutely. Private school students disproportionately outperform their public school counterparts when it comes to pursuing elite college educations and securing well-paid work.
And these outcomes, elite college placement, high-paying jobs, they're not just badges of success.
No, they are scarce goods. They are intrinsically tied to a person's future health, their wealth, their overall well-being. By opting out of the public system, parents are securing a highly competitive advantage for their child in the market for these scarce goods.
And then there's a sociological cost, this peer effect, which I think is often overlooked. When high aspirational, often middle-class children leave the public schools, what happens?
The public system suffers not just from the loss of their potential tuition fees, but from the absence of those peer group effects.
Meaning,
Losing those academically motivated peers and losing the parents who advocate fiercely for resources and quality, it degrades the overall educational and social environment for the children who are left behind. The public system loses social capital, which further entrenches disadvantage.
this moves us directly into the really heavy moral lifting of Section B, the moral calculus of individual choice. This is where the philosophical debate really crystallizes.
Yeah, and we have to confront the argument that choosing a private school is more than just a personal preference. Systemically speaking, it is an act of sabotage against the public system.
Sabotage is a strong word.
It is, but the argument is that it drains participation. It drains money, especially in systems with vouchers, and, crucially, it chips away at public education's legitimacy. Every defection makes it easier for lawmakers to argue the public system is failing and should be defunded even further.
To understand the moral weight of that individual choice, let's look at the philosopher Shelley Kagan's tipping point analogy. It starts with this idea that one person's action seems insignificant.
Right. Kagan uses the example of vegetarianism.
Yep.
One person not buying a chicken seems completely irrelevant to the massive scale of a butcher's operation. But Kagan argues there has to be a logical tipping point where mass action triggers systemic change. If everyone decided to stop buying chickens, the butcher would stop selling them.
So applying this to education, while one family's choice to go private seems minor, Kagan's argument suggests that every choice has this non-negligible moral weight.
Exactly. If every 10th family who defects increases the chance of systemic collapse by 1 in 10, then every parent's choice is contributing either to stabilizing or destabilizing the common good. We can't just assume our individual defection is harmless. It carries a moral risk.
And this sets the stage for the really challenging philosophical critique framed in the school choice and the burdens of justice argument. This perspective challenges the basic idea that parents can justifiably opt out simply to ensure what they call educational adequacy for their child.
Okay, so what exactly does educational adequacy mean in this context?
It's that minimum threshold of schooling necessary for a child to function as a capable citizen, pursue opportunities, and lead a fulfilling life. The critique suggests that while parents have a right to ensure adequacy, they do not have a right to demand competitive superiority at the expense of others.
And this leads to a pretty radical claim. The argument suggests that justice actually demands that parents accept some degree of educational inadequacy for their own children.
Okay, you have to explain that. Why?
To share the burdens of injustice. The core idea is that if you believe the public system is unjust, maybe it's poorly funded, segregated, or failing, you have a civic duty to endure some of that hardship yourself, to accept some imperfection in your child's education in order to collectively fight and fix that systemic injustice.
So opting out in this view is basically evading your civic duty.
It's choosing to evade your share of the burden.
To help measure the injustice of that evasion, the sources introduce these rather abstract analogies of Ron and Robin regarding stolen goods. We need to unpack this carefully.
This analogy is critical, but it's a little high level. So imagine an unjust society where the poor are getting poorer and the rich are getting richer.
Oh, okay.
Ron is already unjustly poor, but he accepts stolen goods that were taken from the poorest sections of society, those who are even more unjustly treated than he is. Robin, on the other hand, accepts goods that were taken from the unjustly rich.
So both acts are wrong because they involve stolen property.
Right, but Ron's conduct is presented as more reprehensible because it compounds the injustice by taking from the most disadvantaged.
Okay, so how does that translate to education and parental choice?
The analogy for education, where no literal goods are being stolen, applies to the capturing of scarce competitive advantages. Opting for private school, which secures a competitive advantage tied to those scarce goods elite college places, high-paying jobs, is seen as being akin to accepting goods that have been indirectly taken from the unjustly poor, those who are left struggling in the severely under-resourced public system.
So, by securing a better outcome for your child through the private system, you are essentially reducing the already slim chances available to the most disadvantaged public school students. You're compounding Ron's injustice.
That's the argument.
That is an extremely heavy moral burden to place on an individual parent. How does the parental defense counter this ethical calculus?
The parental defense argues that prioritizing your own child isn't a calculated ethical failure, but something else entirely. It's an unavoidable drive, which is often described as ethical automatism.
Ethical automatism, what does that mean?
It's this deeply ingrained, biological, almost non-negotiable intuition of parental love. The argument is that a parent's duty to their own child supersedes a distant, abstract duty to systemic justice. It's not a rational choice, it's an ethical imperative.
So if a parent truly believes the public school is harming their child, failing to address a specific need, or even diminishing their identity, the instinct to protect that child is so strong that it just overrides any political convictions about the state.
Right. It's seen as fundamentally immoral not to protect your child when you have the means to do so. And this ties back to respecting a child's autonomy and their specific needs, which the sources highlight with the examples of A, the singer, and B, the dyslexic.
Tell us about those.
So A, the singer desperately wanted specialized training and got a scholarship at a private institution that could nurture that specific talent. Denying this identity-affirming wish is described as morally serious. It's like killing something fundamental to that child's self-concept. It's not just about getting a better grade, it's about allowing the child to become who they are.
And the case of B, the dyslexic, highlights the fear of systemic damage.
Yes. B perceives the world spatially and visually, but is forced into a state system curriculum designed for linguistic sequential thinkers. The fear is that the public system would make strenuous, maybe even coercive efforts to make the child normal, forcing rote memorization over visual learning.
And if those attempts succeeded, the child would be diminished.
They'd suffer a form of personal injury that a parent feels morally obligated to prevent by seeking specialized support, which often only exists in the private sector. The defense rests on the idea that frustrating a child's autonomy and specific needs is morally more serious than adhering to abstract political convictions about a shared burden.
And that brings us to Section C, education as character and value formation. For many parents, the choice is fundamentally about values, not just about outcomes.
Absolutely. Private schools, especially those with religious affiliations, often emphasize a holistic education. They're catering not just to academics, but to spiritual, sporting, and moral needs.
The sources mention Christ's College with its motto, good traditions well maintained.
Right, which explicitly focuses on service and developing virtuous men of good character. They are selling a worldview and a moral framework.
And the sources actually back this up with some fascinating data linking the type of schooling directly to future family stability outcomes.
It's a striking study. It found that boys and girls who attend private schools are statistically more likely to avoid non-marital birth and are more likely to get and stay married later in life. This correlation suggests that the value formation being taught in these environments translates into durable social behaviors.
And the link is strongest among those who attended Protestant schools, according to that data.
Correct. Adults who attended Protestant schools are more than twice as likely to be in an intact marriage and about 60% less likely to have ever divorced compared to public school attendees.
That's not random.
No. It strongly suggests that these schools successfully instill what the sources term a Protestant family ethic, which promotes long-term family stability. For parents who value that outcome, the private system is delivering a specific kind of character formation that the public system, by necessity, just cannot prioritize.
Okay, now we have to navigate what is undoubtedly the most contentious part of the contemporary education debate. The modern ideological battleground, often called the culture war, focusing on arguments against critical social justice, or CSJ, and diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI.
Right, and this is a critique that warrants an impartial, detailed discussion. This perspective comes from individuals who feel that certain CSJ concepts, like critical race theory and radical gender concepts, are being taught in schools as unquestioned truth, rather than being presented neutrally as one theory among many in a dynamic academic debate.
And the data presented in the sources suggests that this type of instruction is highly influential, leading to some demonstrable attitude shifts of work students.
That's right. The sources note that exposure to these concepts is associated with a substantial leftward shift in pupils' attitudes. For example, the sources cite data showing that support for preferential hiring of Black people increases significantly, from 17% among those exposed to no CRT concepts, rising sharply to 44% among those exposed to the maximum 5 concepts studied.
So it's having an intensive ideological impact.
It appears to be. And this exposure also affects feelings of race-based guilt, particularly among white students. The more intensively students are exposed to the CSJ concepts, the more white students report feelings of guilt over historical and current inequality.
So critics view this ideological movement, often framed under the banner of DEI, as advancing objectives that are, in their view, inimical to traditional American ideals.
That's their concern, that traditional values like meritocracy, objectivity, and intellectual rigor are being categorized as white supremacy culture, which they argue is fundamentally undermining the basis of a democratic liberal education.
And this categorization, particularly the challenge to meritocracy, is presented in the sources as posing a specific threat to groups who have historically succeeded through those very values, like Jewish Americans.
Their critique is that for groups like that, their success stories, often following immigration, are based on immense dedication to study, hard work, and intellectual rigor, the very values the DEI framework challenges when it categorizes them as aspects of white culture.
So proponents of meritocracy fear that the entire ideological structure of DEI is designed to dismantle the very mechanisms that allowed groups who faced historical discrimination to succeed through individual achievement.
Exactly. And for these parents, choosing a private school becomes an act of ideological protection, ensuring their children are educated in an environment that reinforces meritocratic values and intellectual pluralism, rather than one that's dedicated to a singular, progressive ideological truth.
To really understand how these intense ethical and ideological battles play out, we need to ground the debate in the legal realities. So let's turn to Section 3, focusing primarily on the U.S. legal framework that dictates the boundaries of public and private education.
Okay, the foundation of the American system is pretty clear. States are fundamentally responsible for providing a minimum public education for all residents.
And this is enforced through compulsory attendance laws.
Right, like in Virginia, which mandates attendance between the ages of 5 and 18. This establishes the baseline expectation and the state's obligation.
But that authority isn't absolute. The U.S. Constitution carves out specific rights, notably through the First and 14th Amendments.
That's right. Students retain significant First Amendment rights, which was upheld in the landmark case Tinker v. Des Moines. This ensured that students don't shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate.
So this would include things like wearing religious clothing or being free from discrimination.
Exactly. However, the school's authority is also protected. Courts mandate that schools have broad authority to ensure an orderly and safe educational environment. Any limitation on student expression has to meet a standard of reasonableness.
Meaning a student's free speech is protected, but if that speech substantially disrupts the educational process, the school has grounds to intervene.
That's it. And the 14th Amendment is also a heavy hitter in the education sphere.
How?
It's absolutely critical. The Due Process Clause requires that students and educators receive the right to a fair and impartial hearing if they believe a constitutional right has been infringed upon. This is the mechanism for appealing teacher dismissals or challenging student discipline that seems arbitrary. And of course, the Equal Protection Clause is the foundation for addressing systemic discrimination.
Okay, moving to Section B, teacher job security and constraints. We've highlighted the precarity of the private school teacher, but the public side operates under its own legal system of protection, namely tenure.
Tenure is a crucial concept here. It's protection from arbitrary dismissal, and it traces back to the Pendleton Civil Service Act of 1883. Crucially, tenure requires due process before a teacher can be dismissed, typically only for justifiable reasons like immoral conduct or insubordination.
So it prevents teachers from being fired just because they disagreed with a principal or because a powerful parent complained.
That's the idea. Advocates argue it strengthens legal protections and significantly increases teacher morale and involvement. It gives teachers the professional autonomy to question leadership on pedagogical or ethical matters without the immediate fear of losing their job.
But tenure is under attack, isn't it? It's driven by these modern accountability mandates.
It is rapidly eroding. Federal mandates, like the Every Student Succeeds Act and the Race to the Top grants. They link significant federal funding directly to student achievement and teacher effectiveness metrics.
So it's all about performance-based accountability now.
Exactly. And this has led states like Florida, Indiana, North Carolina, and Kansas to eliminate or significantly revamp tenure, requiring satisfactory annual performance instead of the lifetime protection tenure historically afforded. The focus has shifted from job stability to measurable outputs.
And even outside of tenure, professional behavior is highly constrained. We mentioned the pressure to comply with dress codes and other expectations.
Teachers sign contracts that include explicit expectations for professional behavior. The case of the charter school teacher in Texas who was fired after wearing a Black Lives Matter mask is a stark illustration of the limits of expression, even on political speech.
Walk us through that case.
Well, the teacher was fired, and the school deemed her to have effectively resigned when she refused to stop wearing the mask. They cited a violation of the dress code due to the current political climate.
So the takeaway is that even in public adjacent charter schools, a teacher's right to political expression is secondary to established policy and the school's desire to maintain an environment free from controversy.
Right. The context of their employment fundamentally constrains their free speech in ways a private citizen's speech is not.
Okay, let's shift focus now to student constraints in Section C, student autonomy and discriminatory policies. We know discipline has to be fair. It has to adhere to that standard of reasonableness.
Correct. Discipline must be fair, reasonable, and demonstrably support the educational process. For example, student suspensions cannot limit the fundamental right to a public education. And while many schools use zero-tolerance policies for serious issues like weapons, these have to be balanced against second-chance policies.
And dress codes, again, are a flashpoint for ethical issues, especially because they often involve gender-biased language.
This is a major area of conflict, and it often leads to stricter enforcement for female minority students. The ethical concerns are about whether these codes oppress certain groups, disproportionately targeting students based on their natural hair, for instance, or whether they inappropriately sexualize young bodies.
Which fueled movements like the #I'mNotADistraction movement.
Exactly. The argument is that schools are shifting the blame for distraction onto the female students' clothing, and legally, this has been challenged successfully.
Tell us about that.
Well, a critical example is the Texas federal court ruling that found a school's policy banning dreadlocks for male students was discriminatory. This policy required a male student to cut his dreadlocks to walk at graduation. The ruling highlighted how dress codes, even if they're framed neutrally, can marginalize racial characteristics and cultural traditions. It shows the legal limits on a school's arbitrary control over student appearance.
Finally, in Section D, we confront the deepest systemic issues: historical segregation and the critique of state indoctrination. The sources provide a really chilling example of how private choice can perpetuate injustice.
This is the Louisiana Segregation Academy example. It's a clear case study of private choice acting as a tool for white flight. A private Christian school was opened in 1965, precisely when public schools began integrating.
And decades later.
Decades later, the town's population is roughly half white and half black. Yet the public school remains 84% black, while the private school is 96.5% white.
Wow. That quantitative disparity just demonstrates how private choice, regardless of any modern intent, can literally perpetuate historical injustice and systemic de facto segregation.
It undermines the entire goal of Brown v. Board of Education. It provides powerful evidence that individual, seemingly innocent choices to opt out can aggregate into profound societal harms. However, the sources also introduce a compelling counter-critique of the public system itself. It's called the anarchist critique.
We need to define this for the listener. When we say anarchist critique, what exactly are we talking about in the context of education?
We're not talking about chaos. We're talking about a philosophical suspicion of centralized power, specifically the state's motives in education. Thinkers like William Godwin, Peter Kropotkin, and Jonathan Kozol suggest that if education is solely left to the government, it will inevitably be used to strengthen its hands and perpetuate its institutions.
So the state's primary goal, they argue, becomes self-preservation and social control, not liberation.
Yes. And Kozol delivers this searing indictment of the U.S. public education system based on this premise. He argues its primary purpose is insidious: to teach fear, impotence, and complacency.
To teach students to be passive.
To be passive recipients of government dictates. Kozol claims that students are encouraged to ask permission for the revolution, meaning they're taught that any real change has to be sanctioned by existing power structures, rather than leveraged through their own power as citizens. The system, in this view, is designed to create a numbed comfort in powerlessness.
So this philosophical viewpoint provides a rationale for private alternatives, regardless of the inequality they might create. If the state system is inherently indoctrinating children into accepting impotence, then any alternative might seem morally preferable.
But the sources don't leave us without a working model of success. They offer the functional example of Finland, which provides a successful counterargument to the idea that quality requires privatization.
Right. Finland achieved educational equity by moving to a public-only system in the 1970s.
And that system succeeded, without conforming to the standardized test obsession that we see in the U.S. The Finnish system operates with no standardized tests except for one optional final one. Teachers have high autonomy in grading and curriculum.
So they have the kind of flexibility you often see in private schools.
They do. And crucially, the teaching profession itself is highly selective and well paid. The key takeaway here is that high-quality, flexible, rigorous education is possible under a public mandate, provided that equity is the explicit systemic goal and teachers are treated as highly respected, autonomous professionals. #tag outro.
This deep dive has spanned massive territory. We began by uncovering the intense job security threatening ethical pressures on private school teachers, being ordered to change grades, navigating competition, feeling that guilt, and we contrasted those micro-dilemmas with the massive societal debate over equity and moral duty.
And the micro and macro tensions are just inextricably linked. We saw the choice to opt out presented simultaneously as a natural, almost unavoidable parental act of love, protecting a child's autonomy, addressing special needs, and as a moral and systemic contribution to growing societal inequality.
Often reinforcing historical segregation.
That's right. So what does this all mean? It means that every decision about where a child goes to school has these profound consequences that just ripple through the entire community. That choice contributes either to stabilizing the burden of injustice in an unequal world or to the shared effort toward collective equity.
And either path requires deep personal sacrifice, whether that's financial, relational, or ethical.
The synthesis really reveals the conflict between two unavoidable duties: that intuitive, deeply wired imperative of parental love and protection versus the duty of justice required to build a decent society where essentials like good schools are equal for everyone and not left to the whims of the competitive free market.
So the pursuit of justice demands something of us.
It demands humility, recognizing current inequities, even if we didn't personally experience them, and it demands pushing for deliberate collective action and reparation, like more equitable funding for public schools, or just investing time and energy in improving your local public option.
And here's the final provocative thought for you to carry forward. We've established that the very flexibility private schools offer can nurture specific talents and provide vital protection from system-wide failures. But if the anarchist critique is correct, and the state system fundamentally indoctrinates children to accept powerlessness, how can parents, regardless of their political convictions or their financial means, pursue both equity and a truly liberating education for their children simultaneously? Is one inherently doomed without the other, forcing parents into a zero-sum game of choice?